All right, so today I want to talk to you about the rose family, Rosaceae, which is a pretty large family of medicinal plants that includes a lot of it's a pretty large family of plants that includes a lot of really well-known medicinal plants, some of which we've already talked about in the course of this course so far. So we've talked about hawthorn, and we've talked about raspberry, for example, and those are both plants in the rose family. And I think, when most people think about roses, let's see, I think this is kind of the sort of image that generally comes to mind, which these plants are very hybridized. They're like these tea roses or long stem roses, modern garden roses in general. They tend to be hybrids of hybrids, and many generations of selective breeding to get them to look the way that they do. And so there are, not so many of the original traits that would be identifying traits of the rose family in them. So I want to show you a pretty close-up picture of hawthorn flowers. And hawthorn flowers look just like a lot of wild roses. They're very similar as far as how the flower is set up. Roses have a very standard geometry that most of them obey, that most of them fit into. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to use this hawthorn flower as an example. So you can see that these have 5 petals, and that's very typical of rose family plants. Most of them have 5 petals that look just like this. Usually they're white or pink. Occasionally there are ones that are some other color besides white or pink, but they're almost always white, or white with some pinkish color to them. And there's sort of 5 petals arranged in the shape of a 5-pointed star, essentially. And one thing that you can see illustrated really well with plants in the rose family is that they have what might be called 4 whorls, 4 circles of plant parts, 3 of which you can see very well in this picture. And these are typically found in some form in other flowering plants as well, but you can see them really well in the rose. And because the rose is such a culturally significant plant, a lot of our ideas about flowers or conceptions about plant anatomy are sort of made with roses being kind of like the original example that people were following when they were describing things. So if you look at the kind of flower that's in the center of this image here, if you look between the petals, you can see some little greenish something behind the petals. And you can see that there are 5 little gaps between the petals. And in each of those gaps, you can see a sort of greenish thing. And what that is the sepal. And the sepals are the first of the 4 whorls of the plant, of the flower. There are 5 of them on roses. And if you think about what the back of a rose looks like, or the underside of a rose flower looks like, they're sort of long, skinny, leaf-like structures. In some other plants, the sepals look more like petals. In some plants, they're fused with the petals, but in roses, they're a separate thing. And they look like a long, skinny, green leaf type thing, and there are 5 of them arranged in the same 5-pointed star type of shape. So that's the first whorl. The second whorl is the petals, of which there are also 5 in this case, and they're white and they're attractive to insects. You know, they're there to get the attention of insects for the most part. That's one of the main reasons they exist. And then those frame another sort of concentric circle of these long pollen-bearing structures, the stamens. This is called the androecium. Collectively, this circle of them is called the androecium. They are the pollen-bearing parts of the plants. You might say the male part of the plant. They carry one of the gametes, analogous to sperm in animals, but it's pollen in plants, and it's carried by bees. In this case, some pollen's borne on the wind and comes from slightly different looking structures. But generally speaking, there is inside the petals of a flower, and especially inside the petals of this rose, a circle of these things. In roses, there will usually be a whole bunch of them, usually more than 10 of them, are arranged inside in a circle inside the middle of the petals. And in the middle of that is the gynecium, which is the female parts of the plant, the parts that become the rose hip or the fruiting body in general, the hawthorn berry in this case. So that's the pistil and the ovaries, which when the pollen connects to them, can fertilize and develop into seeds. So you've got essentially 4 concentric circles. And here you can see that they're all kind of arranged around a central point, or they're all kind of coming out like a little starburst from the central point. And the 5 sepals and 5 petals in the case of these. There are some other plants where that number would be different. Often the number of sepals is equal to the number of petals. And sometimes the sepals also look like petals or do double duty as petals. But this is hawthorn. If you look at some of the roses that are more antique roses or old-fashioned varieties of roses, they look very similar to this as well, and have the same structure. And lots of other plants have some variation of this structure to their flower, where there will be in the very center, the female part of the plant, in the circle around that, the pollen-bearing part of the plant, although in some plants that's on a separate plant or on a separate flower. And then you'll have the petals and then the sepals. All right, I'm going to stop the sharing there. So that is kind of the general structure of a rose flower. And so the ones that you see with lots and lots of petals, those are a mutation. But if you go out and see wild roses growing on their own, whether it's here where they're an invasive species or in some other places where there are native ones, you'll often see that they have a very similar setup with 5 petals and 5 sepals and more than 10 stamens and then a single pistil in the middle. So in addition to all of that, another really common feature that you see in the rose family is that most of them are armed. They have thorns or prickles, something like that. And exactly what those look like are a little different from one species to another. We kind of think of what the thorns on a rose look like. Technically, those might be classified as prickles in modern botany because they are an outgrowth of the plant's skin. They're essentially a projection from the skin of the plant, from the bark, rather than being a specialized type of limb the way that a thorn on a hawthorn plant is. It's more like a little branch, but instead of growing to a full-size branch, it's just a small pointy thing. So there are lots of different types of pokey things that plants can have, but thorns, spines, prickles. But we historically have always referred to the things that grow on on roses as thorns. So in more recent times, botany has kind of redefined them as prickles. But nobody is singing songs about every rose has its prickle or something like that. It's sounds kind of funny. Oh, you're sending us a picture. Yeah, nice. Oh, nice. Yeah, there are wild roses in a lot of places. And there are a lot of introduced multifloral roses here in Kentucky, but there are other wild rose species as well. And then out on the prairies and various other places, there are different species than what we have here. Rock roses, damask roses are more of I think they're originally from Western Asia, but somewhere in Eurasia. A lot of these, because people have cultivated roses as ornamentals and also as sort of like hedges, which in olden times, thorn hedges, rose hedges could be kind of something to keep animals and people in the enclosure and keep wolves and thieves and things like that out. So they were like a little bit of a minor defensive structure historically, and then they came to be very much just something people grew for looks and continue to mostly be that. Yes, you can definitely use wild roses medicinally, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit here. So there are a couple of within the rose family, there are some smaller divisions, or there are some different types of fruit, particularly that you'll see with roses. And so with Rosa itself, with the rose genus, which is called Rosa in Latin, you get rose hips. And rose hips are kind of, they don't have a lot of sweet, fruity flesh on them. What they do have is usually kind of mealy. Sometimes they have at the end where the androecium was, they will have what are called glochids, which are little hair-like prickles that can get in your mouth. So you have to make sure you pluck those out before you eat them. But they do have a little bit of edible flesh on the fruit, and then they have large seeds inside them. People have often made rose hips into soup or stew or preserves of various different sort. They're sweet, so maybe soup isn't the right word, maybe more like compote, but people have stewed them to make a beverage of sorts, which is a good source of vitamin C and antioxidants. The flowers also of most rose species have a lot of antioxidants in them. Of Rosa, of the genus Rosa, not the entire family Rosaceae necessarily, though a lot of them do, but not all of them. So Rosa is one big section that gives us a lot of medicinal plants, and those are the ones that we just call roses for the most part. And there are other plants that have similar fruits to them. For example, hawthorns are very similar to rose hips. There's apples are kind of similar too, in a way. They have the same general structure as what a rose hip does, an apple or a pear. They have the similar flowers to roses. They have, and then the fruit, has a lot more fruit to it, but then it has a sort of hard casing with the seeds inside it in the middle, like a rose hip would have. Sometimes people will refer to apples and pears collectively as pomes, or that type of fruit, P-O-M-E, which is just kind of like the old French word for apple, which would be pomme in modern French, with two M's instead of one. But so that's one style of fruit that you find a lot in the rose family. Another style of fruit that you find a lot is a stone fruit. So this would be especially in the genus Prunus, which gives us also some medicinal species. So Prunus contains plums, which is what the name Prunus actually originally refers to, is plums, prunes, once they're dried. So they have, as you know, a soft fruit with one hard stone in the middle, and you crack the stone open, there's a seed in the middle of that. Almonds are also in this group. They have exactly the same thing. The almond is actually the seed from the inside of the middle of the fruit. So you've also got peaches and some other things like blackthorn or Prunus spinosa, which is a very thorny hedge that grows in Europe, and the berries, the little tiny plums that grow on it, are called sloes in English, SLOE, and people have used them to make beverages. People have eaten them. Sometimes they're very sour until they're fully ripe, but very acidic. But they are edible, and when they're ripe, they taste basically just like plums, but they're very small. So that's another style of fruit that you find that would just have one hard stone in the middle of it. Another variation that you find within the rose family is the raspberry or blackberry style fruit, which is basically a cluster of little fruits that have one single seed in the middle of them. So raspberries, blackberries, and there's some other lesser known ones like cloudberries and salmonberries, and these are all part of the genus Rubus. Rubus idaeus is the red raspberry, which is kind of the most common one used in herbal medicine that comes from Western European traditions. Blackberries very much used medicinally in this part of the world. Both the fruit and the leaves and the roots all contain astringent acids that can be good for treating diarrhea. And the fruit is the mildest version, and the root is the most powerful version of that. Just a second. Is that what sloe gin is made from? It's at least what it's flavored with, or something that is flavored with, more so than necessarily what the alcohol is made from. But yeah, that's why it's called that. And so yeah, these are kind of sort of big sections of the rose family. It would be like the stone fruit section, the raspberry section, and then the rose and apple section of it. So some of these plants contain some poisonous substances. The bark and the seeds of all the stone fruits contain some cyanide producing compounds. And then the seeds of apples and pears contain the same stuff, which you might call here sometimes referred to just as, sometimes people will say that it's cyanide or it's cyanogenic, or there's prussic acid. But what it really is a substance called amygdalin, which breaks down into cyanide as it's digested or as it oxidizes. And so it's named after amygdala, which is the word for almond in Latin. And bitter almonds in particular have this substance in them in large amounts. And there's sort of I don't know, a modern legend that that it's a B vitamin, B17, and that it's kind of a treatment for cancer. And it doesn't actually seem to be all that effective for cancer from the research that's actually been done on it. It does have, some history of use in that direction, but not a whole lot. And it is somewhat poisonous. Although, in the amounts that occur in food, it's not something you have to worry much about. If you eat an apple and you eat the seeds, it's not going to kill you. If you save up the seeds from a whole bunch of apples and you eat them all together, then, then that might. But in the concentrations that it normally occurs in, probably not going to be a big problem. And that's the main thing that you have to worry about as far as toxicity from plants in the rose family. And like I said, that's not in all plants in the rose family. It's just in a handful of them, many of which we eat as food on a regular basis. So there are a number of different types of substances that show up over and over in the rose family, and I want to talk some about those. The kind of most obvious and most innocuous of which would be antioxidants. A lot of rose family plants contain some antioxidants like catechin and epicatechin that are mild anti-inflammatory substances. And these are things that historically people would get them either from eating the foods that come from the rose family or from making preparations out of the rose petals. The petals of roses and other members of the rose family have often been made into tea, into tinctures, wine extracts. There is a tradition of making rose oil by distilling the essential oil from rose petals. This was an extreme luxury product in ancient times. And the reason that it was is because that's not mostly what's in roses. So roses contain some essential oil, but you have to use a tremendous amount of rose petals to get a tiny amount of rose essential oil. And so that's a very strong, very concentrated, but also somewhat denatured rose-based medicine. But it has a history of use, especially as something that people use as a perfume, something that people put on sachets or handkerchiefs to breathe it in, with the idea that it was uplifting, that it elevated the mood and consciousness, and kind of made people feel better through the way that it smelled, and maybe also help the lungs. I'm not sure how, I think that back when it was a more popular remedy, that the human environment tended to smell a lot worse than it does now, and that is part of why it was so sought after. But it is something that was also just sort of a flex, sort of a way for people to show off wealth, because it was and is very expensive, because it takes an enormous amount of roses. People have also used dried rose petals as medicine, powdered them, made them into powdered them, mixed them with a little bit of binder, like the cherry gum that I talked about, or like gum arabic or tragacanth gum, which are used similarly. Soak the gum in a little bit of water for a long time, and then use that water to turn the powdered herb into sort of a mud-like substance, and then roll that into pills. And Michel de Nostradamus, who's today mostly remembered as a psychic, but in his own time, he was mostly thought of as a doctor or herbalist. He was using these during the bubonic plague, pills made of roses. And, I don't know how well they worked. It's kind of hard to say. They had quite a reputation for being good, but that doesn't always mean that they really were, especially when someone's out there trying to sell them. But that is traditionally something that people used to stave off respiratory infections, and for a variety of other medicinal purposes. We know that they contain large amounts of vitamin C. We know that they contain large amounts of antioxidants. So they probably have some minor helpful effects in a wide variety of different conditions. And that would be true not only of tablets made from them, but teas made from them as well. The rose hips also contain a lot of vitamin C. The seeds of roses are often a part that's been used medicinally. It's possible to press oil from rose seeds, just like you could do with olives if you have a stone press to crush them with, or some other sort of heavyweight press that would crush the seeds. It's possible to crush oil out of large quantities of them. And that oil has been used as a topical treatment for skin issues like psoriasis and eczema, and also taken internally for parasites. I use Rosa rugosa. This is one of our roses that sometimes grows wild around here. I use a tincture of the rose hips, the rose seeds specifically from the rose hips, as an anti-parasitic. And it works pretty well for that. It's, mild enough to use with children, which some of the things like, some other things like wormwood or fern root that are a little more harsh, I would be more hesitant to use with children, but the rose is really safe and generally effective as well. It's a little harder to make, a little more painstaking to produce. So sometimes I use the other ones for adults and use that for children. Let's see. So those are some of the medicinal properties that would be common in rose family plants, that they would have anti-inflammatory properties, maybe some anti-parasitic properties, often nutritive, often containing vitamin C and similar substances, which are also antioxidants. The ones that have berries, or even just really not just the ones that have berries, a lot of them contain some meaningful degree of a class of compounds called anthocyanidins, which are what make blackberries dark purple, and also what make red roses have some red to them as well. It's a big category of chemical compounds that are antioxidants, that help with tissue healing as well. So those are some good properties and good types of beneficial compounds and beneficial virtues that come up over and over again in the rose family. Kind of as more of an example, but also, well, I want to talk about our multifloral rose, which is very common here in Kentucky, as both as an example of the medicinal properties and to talk about the ecological roles and things like that roses can play. And use that sort of as an example of some of the things that I'm talking about. So multifloral rose is something that I think was introduced here as an ornamental. It is a bush. It's usually about waist high or so. Seldom gets as tall as a person, but is often, it's not a creeping ground cover either. So it's about waist high or somewhere around there. In the summertime, the stems are green. Right now, a lot of them are sort of dark purple. They'll survive over the winter, or a lot of them will. And it's called multifloral rose for the obvious reason that it produces a whole bunch of flowers at once. Like at the end of one stem, it'll have a cluster of flowers, which turns into a cluster of rose hips. And the rose hips ripen pretty slowly. And then in the winter, usually after it freezes, but not necessarily, they get ripe late fall, early winter or so, and then birds eat them when there isn't a lot of other good stuff out there to eat. They're not particularly high value as a food. They're not real They don't have a lot of sweetness or a lot of carbs in them. There is some oil in the seeds, although I don't think that most birds are able to break up the seeds as easily. I think they usually swallow them and swallow the seeds and then poop the seeds out, and then they grow. And they grow in disturbed grounds and old pastures, and they will form pretty thick tangles that keep larger creatures from walking through them. So, little birds can dart in and out of them pretty easily, but big birds like hawks cannot really get into the thickets of them very easily. So they become sort of a refuge for small birds who then, spread them elsewhere. And so they're very successful as a weedy species because they're providing food to the birds and also providing habitat to the birds. And then the birds are, taking them and distributing them and growing more of them and creating more habitat for themselves. And when they're well fed and they're well protected, guess what they do? They make more birds who then spread more berries around. So it sometimes competes with, often coexists with, and sometimes competes with our native Rosaceae species that fill a similar role, which would be blackberries and black raspberries here in the bluegrass and in much of eastern Kentucky. Typically, if you go somewhere like Heisel Farm Park, where we've done some of our herb walks, or the cut down area under a power line, or the edge of a forest where it meets a field somewhere, you'll often find them all growing together. You'll often find blackberries and raspberries and multifloral roses. The multifloral rose, though, is more shade tolerant than either blackberries or raspberries. So sometimes you will find it growing right along trails in the woods, or especially old logging roads and things like that, where there's a trail wide enough to drive a vehicle down, which gives a little gap that sunlight will come down through, but it's still pretty dark most of the day, pretty shady most of the day, except when the sun's right above it. So you'll often find it growing in and sometimes overgrowing those types of spaces, which are a little too shady for blackberries and somewhat on the shady side for black raspberries. So it's because it fruits slowly, it can take as long as it needs to collect the sunshine that it needs to put in the carbs. So it's collecting calories from the sun and putting those into the fruit. But the fruit is not real high calorie, doesn't have a whole lot of sugar in it, doesn't have a whole lot of energy in it. And the fruit develops very slowly compared to the fruit of a blackberry or a raspberry. So it's able to thrive sometimes in areas with less energy coming from the sun than those would be able to thrive in. And of course, it fruits sort of at the opposite time of the year that they do. Like I said, the multifloral rose fruits are at their most edible in the winter or late fall and winter. They tend to persist on the bush till spring or so, and then they will fall on the ground if they haven't already been eaten somewhere around this time of year, as it's starting to get ready to put up new growth for this summer's flowering. It puts out new leaves, and then it puts out new flowers, and then it puts out new fruit, which gets slowly ripe until following winter. So the birds are able to eat the blackberries and raspberries, not just birds, of course, raccoons, deer, everybody, humans. Everybody loves blackberries and raspberries, and they're ripe in the summertime. And then nobody really prefers to eat the rose hips, but they'll do if you're about to starve, and they're ripe in the wintertime when you're most likely to be about to starve if you're a small woodland creature relying on fruit for your sustenance. So it's kind of taking up or creating for itself, finding for itself an ecological niche in which it's very successful. When I make medicine out of this plant, I make two different medicines out of it, or I make medicine out of two different parts of it, one of which is the flowers and one of which is the seeds. And so a lot of the time with the seeds, I'll actually just take the whole fruit, dry it thoroughly, crush it up, make sure it's dry after I've crushed it up, and then make an oil infusion of it. And that's going to get, and that oil infusion I make as a warm oil infusion. So I'm actually heating it to the point where the oil is seething and then letting it sit at a warm temperature for a few hours and then letting it cool and straining it. And that is getting some of the oil-based antioxidants and other substances out of the seeds. And then the extract of the flowers contains a lot of antioxidants. Sometimes, well, really usually it will have a pinkish and sometimes even a very reddish color, even though it's made from white flowers. So you can go out and you can pick a whole big bag of multifloral rose petals. Once you've dried them, if you dry them, there's really not that much left to them. They're very light. You can either dry them or use them while they're still wet and make a tincture out of them. And that's a nice antioxidant remedy. It's a mild anti-inflammatory. It's kind of cooling for the digestive system and for the body in general. And often I'm using that along with other things like Tulsi or St. John's wort as a mood elevating type of thing. Rose and Tulsi is a really nice combination. So that's something that I've used quite a bit, and that if you have some sort of semi-feral land or some land that you're able to harvest from that's in the process of in the transition between being field and being forest, then there's you can usually find a great abundance of multifloral roses. And because they create a barrier, because they grow in thick clumps that are difficult to traverse, they actually will help to keep areas from being grazed down by deer or other animals, and kind of keep human foot traffic to a minimum through them. And so that they are sort of a protector species in the forests that they end up in. Even though they're generally considered an invasive species around here, they actually will protect the seedlings of things like oak and walnut trees, and well, other trees too, but allow them to grow, and then those will mature into forest trees eventually. Red cedar is often also found growing amongst them. It's very much also adapted to that sort of transition plant community, as pastures and fields and clear cuts and various other human disruptions are turning into forest or more uncultivated, more wild type of land. It's the red cedar is often there and has a similar role in terms of being a fruit that's around in the winter, being a somewhat bristly habitat for small creatures, and being a transition species between field and forest. So it's a little less prickly and a little more of a tree than the multifloral rose is. Although depending on the soil conditions, I've seen a red cedar tree stay about 6 inches tall for a decade. I've also seen them go from being nothing to being taller than a person in 3 years or so. So they can mature at varying rates. The multifloral rose, it usually, like I said, gets about waist high, and it gets that tall pretty quickly. it gets that tall in basically 2 seasons, and then begins flowering and reproducing. And they don't just spread by their seeds, they spread by growing as well. So they tend to, yeah.
So it's so funny, you were just talking about tree saplings between blackberries and multiflora rose, and I have that exact little neighbors growing on my hillside. It was so funny.
Yeah.
We were walking up the trail one day, and there was this very teeny tiny little oak sapling popped up, and it was right in the middle of multiflora rose on one side and blackberry bushes on the other, and it was just so cute.
Yeah, it's a slow speed drama that you can see playing out in lots of places. It's something that it's a very typical plant community, a very typical interaction that you see among plants in a certain type of habitat, which is a very widespread type of habitat around here.
What did you call the little hairy things inside of the rose hips? You called them something specific. What was that?
Glochid, Glocchid.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and they are similar to the smaller prickles that would occur on prickly pear. So prickly pear has this longer spines, and then it has little hair-like ones that kind of get on your skin and are hard to get off, or heaven forbid, get in your mouth and are hard to get out of the lining of your mouth. But so they're irritating to kind of keep animals from eating them as much. They want animals to eat them eventually, just not right away. Let's see. Yeah, so that's kind of the deal with multifloral roses. A lot of people, like I said, consider them a real nuisance. And in some ways they, I think, are a nuisance because they are at cross purposes with humans a lot of the time. People want open spaces, and multifloral roses want to close those spaces off. But they create good habitat for small burrowing creatures and birds as well, as do the other prickly rose family plants that you would find growing in the same types of fields. So it's, by no means an essential species to this environment. It really doesn't belong here, but when it is here, it's I feel like not as overtly harmful as some other invasive species are, like bush honeysuckles, which just kind of shade out everything, and or maybe not as good for the creatures. So anyway, that's multifloral rose. The other herb that I want to talk about today is a pretty different type of member of the rose family. Let me see if I can find a picture of it as well. I think I've got one on here. Hmm. Hang on just a second. Mhm. So this is meadowsweet. And if you look very closely at the flowers of meadowsweet, it has the same whorls. And if you look at the leaves, they're kind of similar to the leaves of a blackberry plant, or at least they have the texture of a blackberry's leaves with the shape of a rose's leaves. So meadowsweet is in the rose family. There's a blackberry plant growing behind it in this one. It's in the rose family, but it's a little bit of a different looking type of plant. Meadowsweet is not common around here. It doesn't really grow here unless you grow it. It's called Aragitlus silver herb in my language, in Irish. But this is a plant that contains salicin, a pretty strong anti-inflammatory. Latin name of it is Spirea ulmaria, and well, it used to be, maybe filipendula, either Spirea or filipendula, but Spirea is the kind of source of the name aspirin, because this is actually was a popular medicinal plant when they started making synthetic aspirin. So aspirin was sort of like a synthetic version of this. And actually, if you made a vinegar extract of Spirea, you'd get something an awful lot like aspirin. And people had been doing that for a long time. But willow is also a source of it that's more well known over here in the States, because willows grow here and meadowsweet doesn't. But meadowsweet contains not just salicin, but some other salicylates, some other related compounds, which are good anti-inflammatory and pain relieving, and fever reducing, and heart attack and clot preventing remedies. So it has a really nice variety of widely applicable medicinal uses, and where it grows, it's a pretty commonly used plant. And for whatever reason, it's never, unlike plenty of other European plants like valerian, about which you could say the same thing, that it doesn't grow here unless someone grows it usually, and that it's not native here. For whatever reason, meadowsweet hasn't really become a popular commercial herb in the United States, which is fine. We have plenty of popular commercial herbs, but it is a really good garden plant. It's pretty easy to grow if you get seeds for it. In its native range, it's basically just something that comes up in meadows on its own. It doesn't have thorns or anything like that. And it is also sweet, flavored, as the name suggests. So it's a good medicinal plant to know about. It's something that you could conceivably grow enough of for personal use, or for it to be an herb in your apothecary that you use sometimes, but not all the time, in just a small area, like a little garden bed or something like that. You can grow a fair bit of it. As you can see from the picture, one plant produces quite a bit of plant material. So it's not a small plant. It's, knee high to waist high, has a lot of leaves and flowers on each plant. And the whole above ground part is usable as medicine, for medicinal purposes. So it's a good one to know about. And it's a member of the rose family that's quite different from multifloral rose. And is something that I like using, partly because it's part of the tradition of my family's herbal medicine, and where we came from, it was a common remedy. So when we came over here, we kept using it. But like I said, not a real common one in the herbal medicine world in the United States, pretty well known to herbalists in England and Ireland. It's in all the old books and stuff like that. A lot of old herbals and things like that from Europe. It does grow in parts of Asia as well. And, is a easily forageable plant in its native range. A question here, what are your recommendations for length of time you can use meadowsweet? It depends on the dosage, but I would say if somebody is taking half a teaspoon a day, 50 years, I mean, you can really use it for a long time. You wouldn't want to use large doses all the time because it is kind of blood thinning and it could potentially lead to maybe more bruising and stuff like that. Although that's not always something you see with salicylate containing herbs. Sometimes they do that and sometimes they don't. But generally speaking, small doses you could take on a long-term basis. For my part, I usually would use it for incident things that would not be long-term, like a headache or a fever or some joint pain or something like that. And, if it's something like a sore back and you want somebody to take it whenever they're feeling pain and that ends up being 5 days a week, it's fine to do it like that for pretty much long periods of time. So I don't really place a particular time limit on its usage. Certainly, for some people, salicylate containing herbs can be hard on the stomach as well, and that could be an issue. But for the most part, if somebody is in pain, I find that dealing with that pain is often, and dealing with the inflammation behind that pain or related to that pain is often going to be a better outcome than what would happen if you didn't. So for example, I think that meadowsweet is a lot less hard on someone's body than ibuprofen or Tylenol or something like that. It's more what we're made to metabolize. And so, if it was a choice between someone taking meadowsweet, suffering in pain, or taking a more poisonous pain reliever, then I think the meadowsweet is the best of the options for that situation. But yeah, it's generally something that if you took it for on a long-term basis, you wouldn't necessarily see any problems with it. As a tea for headaches for children, I think it's okay. I don't really give salicylate containing herbs to babies. But for 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, I don't really see much of a problem with that. I usually, if they seem to have a viral illness or something like that, I'll usually use something different for that and not use it as a fever reducer. I'm not always necessarily trying to reduce people's fevers either, because I think fevers do useful work. But yeah, it's for occasional use in older kids, in middle childhood age kids, not teenagers and not babies. I think that it's fine. All right, so. And yeah, a lot of the time what I find with meadowsweet is if someone has headaches frequently and they take meadowsweet on a daily basis, like if someone's having headaches multiple times a week and you give them meadowsweet every day, a lot of the time after a couple of weeks, they won't have headaches as frequently anymore. And sometimes that will have a pretty long-term effect on just kind of bringing down that baseline level of inflammation and bringing down that, bringing people kind of, I envision it as sort of bringing them away from the edge of having a headache, and that some people are kind of always on that edge. So it's good for the inflammatory part of that. There's often, like I said, during the class on headaches, often a lot of features involved, like inflammation, muscle tension, sometimes immune responses, things like that. They're all going on together, or that are all playing a role, and it mainly has an effect on the inflammatory part of that. But a lot of the time you can get a lot of mileage out of just bringing down the baseline inflammation in someone's body. Just a moment. All right, so those are two herbs from kind of slightly different parts of the rose family that both have really different medicinal properties, although there is some relation between them as far as the chemical pathways that go into making the different substances in them, the organic acids that act as antioxidants in the Rosa genus end up being converted into some of the anti-inflammatory properties, anti-inflammatory compounds and virtues in the meadowsweet genus. So they're related, but with a lot of diversity within that relation. And of course, if you look at the rose family as a whole, you have things like cherry that can be a very large tree. And we've seen the black cherry trees on some of our herb walks, and they're full-size trees. Not as big as oak trees, but they can be pretty large trees. And then, you can get much shrubs and herbs and kind of bushes, large bushes, or small creeping ground cover type plants, and then herbaceous plants like the meadowsweet that are all in the same family. Some things like strawberries and cinquefoils and lady's mantle, alchemilla, that are soft plants. They don't have a woody component to them the way that the berry bushes or rose bushes do, let alone like what the trees have. So a whole wide variety of different different habits, different shapes of plant bodies, and as well as having a lot of kinship as far as the geometry of how they grow, the plant parts and how the flowers are arranged. And even if you look at something like, I've noticed that some fruit trees are starting to bloom right now, which is on the early side for things, but some of them are starting to. If you get a chance to walk up to one of those and look at it, and then compare that to the hawthorn picture that we just looked at, you'll see the same kind of thing: 5 petals and 5 sepals, and a circle of male plant parts and then a single female plant part, all together, arranged around the same center like that. So you get that same type of thing. I had an interesting experience with that shape, that geometry, that I think that I'd like to share, which is that when I was in Central Asia, I was doing herbal medicine with some different people in the marketplace there. And at one point, I was gathering some herbs with a Kazakh woman from Kazakhstan. And she was talking about actually not the shape of the flower, but the arrangement of the leaves on a raspberry plant, which is in the same 5-pointed star type of shape. And she said that it was an herb of Venus, basically. I mean, the word they use is Chopin, which it means the shepherdess, but that's their word for the celestial body of Venus. And she related the shape of that leaf pattern and also that 5-pointed star flower pattern to the path that this celestial body, Venus, which in both Greek and Kazakh lore is kind of thought of as being a fertility goddess, or the kind of star-based avatar or character of a fertility goddess, the path that it traces across the sky, which I didn't really understand what she was telling me about the path that it traced across the sky until I went and looked it up. But it actually does trace a path across the sky over time, or appears to from Earth trace a path across the sky that looks like a 5-pointed star or like a rose. So I thought that was interesting, and I wondered if the shape of the rose and the plant, the raspberry plant in particular, being used for fertility and as a tonic for the uterus and associated organs might be part of the reason why the planet Venus was associated with the concept of fertility. I wasn't really sure about that part, but I thought it was an interesting bit of lore, or interesting comparison that had been drawn at least by nomadic Kazakh people who don't have a fixed horizon, so they don't really necessarily have the most involved concept of stargazing or astronomy or whatever. They have names for the different shapes of stars in the sky and names for what we would call the planets, but they don't really have a lot of, they don't have nearly the history of stargazing and astronomical observation that non-nomadic people around them have, like the Persians and the Uzbeks. Because when you move around all the time, the horizon changes, and it kind of, affects which stars are in the sky at any particular time. Anyway, that's kind of, a parallel that had been drawn between that celestial body, Venus or Chopin, and fertility. And I don't know if there's really what the connection is between the two, but I thought that it was interesting that they, equated that with the raspberry plant and the shapes of its flowers and leaves. Okay, so there's a question here. Do you prefer using a vinegar-based tincture or alcohol base for meadowsweet? And what other herbs complement meadowsweet as an infusion for pain and headaches? I like meadowsweet with sweet birch. I also like it with ginger. Those two can go together pretty well. Yeah, ginger is one that I use with it a lot. I really like the vinegar-based extract, but a lot of people find vinegar really objectionable too. So, to me, it always comes down to what are people actually going to take. So sometimes I do it in a white wine that turns a little bit vinegary, and infuse it in that. And I like to use the white because you can kind of see the color coming out of the plant when you do it that way. Whereas with apple cider vinegar, you can't so much, and with alcohol, you can quite a lot because it's clear. But because the white wine is sort of yellowish, it'll come out into that and make it, look more reddish as the antioxidants are coming out of the plant itself.
So you said you use a white wine vinegar? Is that what you said?
Sometimes I just use white wine, which sort of turns vinegary. It turns into
Oh.
vinegar because it's not in a sealed container anymore. If it's allowed to breathe a little bit. Because if you put herbs in wine and you put it in a sealed jar, then sometimes it will ferment more and it'll turn into an effervescent type of thing, or sometimes it will make the glass shatter. So because the carbs in the herb can actually make the fermentation in the wine continue to go on or to restart, and that can make either something that will fizz, sometimes violently, or something that might break the glass. So if you cover it with a couple layers of cheesecloth held on with like the ring part of the lid of a mason jar, then it will not, that won't happen. And then but it will also kind of tend to turn a little more acidic, a little more sour, because of its exposure to the air and because of sort of a different type of fermentation happening. The fermentation is still happening, it's just not building up pressure to make it effervesce or break. Yeah, I think that multifloral rose petals are really it's kind of a meditative medicine to gather, because it takes a long time. You really have to you're picking all these flower petals, and if you want to get like a medium-sized bag full of them, it's going to take quite a bit of picking. You think of it being like giving somebody a bouquet of roses, but it's all in like one spoonful of medicine, which I kind of like the idea of that. And roses kind of have probably more than any other flower a really major place in cultural consciousness, as being something that people have used as like a motif or a decoration, or a symbol of love and things like that. So I think using them as medicine sort of carries all those emotional connotations and things, which could be considered baggage, but I also think of it more in a positive light, as being like a set of beautiful thoughts and ideas that go along with the medicine. So, and that and the antioxidants work together, and the other substances in them. Really, surprisingly, there's not so much research on what roses actually do in the human body, even though there's a whole lot of history of use, often involving very grandiose claims for them. And there's a whole lot of, like I said, cultural connotations around them. And there's even quite a bit of research into like the antioxidants and things like that, but not so much into why they do what they've been traditionally ascribed to do, as far as changing consciousness, being uplifting, and that sort of thing. And it could be that that's just sort of harder to study and quantify, but it is something that I feel like people could make more of an effort to learn about than what they have done so far. All right, so Any question about either of those herbs or about the rose family in general? So, yeah, rose. I really feel like rose is helpful for grief, and along with, I usually use it along, almost always use it along with other herbs. In your case, chamomile and lavender are really good calming herbs. I often use it along with, like I said, holy basil, tulsi, which is a really uplifting kind of combination. But yeah, it's nice. It feels good to people. I feel like it has some difficult to quantify uh, properties that are, as yet poorly measured and not well understood, but still fairly strongly historically attested to. A rose is a rose is a rose and all that. Uh, yeah. So I know I mentioned the fruit trees starting to bloom. One thing, if I really encourage everybody to get out into the world as much as possible over the next couple of weeks, because like the plant world is kind of coming alive. Not that it was ever dead, but it's really becoming much more active, much more lively. So 2 weeks ago, there was only a dandelion here and there. Now there are lots and lots of them. Violets are blooming, which is early for them. Everything's happening a little early here in Lexington right now because we didn't really have, such a winter as we had was basically from like the 24th through 27th of December. And that was about all we got. It was just, brutally cold for a few days and then just kind of has been a really mild winter apart from that one really vicious cold snap. When I brought the chickens inside and when the pipe in the old clinic burst. Seems so long ago now. But yeah, so anyway, we're having a really early spring. Lots of things coming up right now. Lots of plants to gather for your plant collection if you're still doing that. And it's a really good time to keep an eye on what's going on out there. One thing that I think is very observable that is worth noting is that there's these invasive pears, calorie pears, which are also part of the rose family, and like the multifloral rose, are kind of bird distributed. They are one of the first trees that flower with white flowers. So if you're driving down the highway or around the belt line around the city or whatever, you'll often see patches of them. And a lot of the time it'll be like a big clump of trees that are all the same age that all started growing at the same time. And they'll be in white flower here soon. They're starting, I saw one opening up yesterday. So pretty soon they'll all be opened up. And these are, they're an invasive pear species and they flower white before the other white flowering rose family trees, which is kind of the easiest way to identify them, especially from afar. Once they start growing, the leaves are kind of nondescript. There's nothing else about them that's like really super obvious that that's what the plant is. But when they're coming into this white flower early in the season, you can see that that's what they are. And I know that some counties are like offering bounties on people that cut them down, for people that cut them down and bring them in, because they're kind of an invasive species that sticks around for a while. Ooh, Jennifer has shared a picture of a trout lily. This is a really lovely wildflower that grows in the woods around here. Trout lilies are a bulb, and sometimes the bulb, it has this really fascinating trick that it does where it puts out roots, and then those roots shrink up and contract, and they will pull the bulb further into the ground. So sometimes the bulb will actually be many feet underground, even though the seed that it grew from, if it grew from seed, is doesn't penetrate into the ground very far at all. It's just like right there under the leaf litter and begins growing. And then it, kind of drags itself further and further into the ground and then puts up a long stem with these leaves that have this mottled color, which I think is why it's called trout lily. And there are white ones, whitish. Sometimes they're a little pinkish or purplish ones that flower first. And then about the time the white ones are finishing up, the yellow ones come on. And the yellow ones look just like that, but yellow. Let's see if I have a picture of that. Let's see. Oh, well, I don't seem to be able to find it, but yes, there's a yellow variety of it that looks rather the same, but yellow. The leaves the petals are folded back like that. They open so far that the petals are kind of folded over, folded backwards. And it has that splotchy purple and green leaf that initially kind of blends in with the forest floor with the mottled, dappled sunlight that comes down to the forest floor. But the yellow one, the modeling is often not as evident on the yellowish one. Yeah, they're small, and sometimes when you find a hillside full of them, you can find. Sometimes you can see a stand of them that contains thousands of members at a time. Sometimes you just see one here and there, depending on where you are in the woods. But it's a lovely time to be out in the woods if you have that kind of woods near you. But even if you're just going out to some unmowed fields or whatever, you can probably see many different species of plants blooming and starting to bloom right now. And of course, along with them, the animals that forage them, that eat them or that drink their pollen and drink their nectar and eat their pollen and so forth are all coming into full swing right now. Yeah, the leaves of trout lily are pretty neat, and you can actually eat the leaf as well. I usually don't eat many of them because I want it to grow and make food for the plant. But if you do eat them, they taste sort of like sugar snap peas, sweet and kind of got that same crunchy texture. They're a lovely plant. Trillium is also starting to bloom right now. Trillium is another interesting place to see the different whorls of the plant. It has 3 sepals and 3 petals, and then it has the reproductive parts inside the middle of the flower. But outside of that, it has 3 big leaves, which kind of match with the same general geometry of it. So it's a really lovely plant. There are many species of Trillium here in Kentucky, and the earliest couple of them, the snow trilliums, which are white, and the sessile trilliums, which are purple and also have a mottled leaf similar to what the trout lily has. Those are opening up right now. So yeah, if at all possible, get out into nature. I know I say that all year round, but especially right now and for the next, from now until the end of this course, there's going to be amazing stuff happening constantly in the plant world. Beautiful, showy displays of springtime in the plant world. So I heartily encourage everyone who has the opportunity to get out and get involved into that. In other news, the week after next, I mean, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, I'm going to do an open house here at the clinic for anyone who wants to come and see what the new space looks like and everything like that. So would love for any of you to attend that would like to. And I'll be doing some, I'm doing an herb walk for this course, and then probably also one that's just kind of open to the general public in the next few weeks as well. So I, want to extend that to everybody here, that if you want to come and be part of that, I would love to have you. And like I said, there's going to be stuff very much worth seeing going on in the plant world in the near future. So keep that in mind. All right. Any other questions for today? Yeah, I'll be sad when it's over too. I really enjoyed working with everybody here, and I'm trying to figure out a way to do a continued thing for people who complete this course. It probably won't be a once a week class because there won't be that many people. But I do want to do something, probably something that meets on some sort of a regular basis, and also has involved some guided self-study for further learning for people who want to kind of take things to a higher level as far as studying herbal medicine goes. And I would love for anyone present to be part of that. All right. So yeah, next week I'll send out an email to this effect as well. But next week we'll be doing this on Wednesday as well, and then after that I'll be back to doing it on Tuesdays at the usual time. So thanks for your patience with that, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Good night.